Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Films. My name is Alan. Ubisoft games are the worst. They create these massive empty maps for you to run around on and force you to do a bunch of fetch quests. There's no story, there's no depth, there's no change in gameplay, and worst of all, you feel like you're playing a Ubisoft game with the same tired mechanics that have been passed down from their Generation 1 games like the first Far Cry and the first Assassin's Creed. It just stops getting interesting after the 10th iteration of the same thing. And I'm looking at you, Call of Duty, with all of your Madden-like patterns of nonsense. And worst of all, once these developers realize that a certain pattern works, they just phone everything else in. There's no inspiration behind their game, there's no spark of creativity. You kind of get the sense that these developers just want to shoot themselves in the face, but the paychecks are really good and we can't really blame them because everyone has bills to pay. Now that I'm older, I don't really have time to just sit down and play video games nearly as much as I should, so I've become picky about the type of games I do like to play. I've also realized now what kind of games I like, ones with depth and character, with fully realized worlds. I've always said that this is the reason why I love Star Wars, not because of the individual storylines or the sand-hating moisture farmers of Tatooine, but because the Star Wars galaxy is so in-depth and has so much detail, it almost feels real. Which is why now I try to play games from studios that actually spent the right amount of time on their games and create a product that they're actually proud of. Rockstar is a publisher I firmly believe in. They spend crazy amounts of time in development to make sure that their games are a piece of art. Red Dead Redemption took 7 years to make and it's a masterpiece and still won't be one 10 years from now. They are one of the only publishers that can make an open world feel real and lived in. Polish developer 3D Project Red is another studio that I hold in high regard. They did things right with gradual jumps in budget and ambition, from Witcher 1 to Witcher 2 to Witcher 3, and now their massive Cyberpunk 2077 game, which is probably going to make me disappear from YouTube for a week or a month. But you guys all have heard of Rockstar and you've probably heard of 3D Project Red as well by now. There is another developer that also works the same type of enthusiasm and magic into their games, albeit with a smaller budget, and that's the Ukrainian multi-studio known as 4A Games. They were able to produce the critically acclaimed Metro 2033 for about 10% of what other big budget FPSs in the same genre were spending. Their main offices at the time were located in government buildings in Kiev, which were not only cramped and tiny, but also prone to losing power and heat, so the developers would just wear parkas at work, which I'm sure helped them relate to the freezing characters that lived inside their beautiful realized digital worlds. The first two games in the Metro series were not massive or high budget. As a matter of fact, they were extremely linear, but through beautiful art design, thoughtful use of dialogue, and character interaction, they built a game that felt so customized and so unique that as you're playing in it, you can't help but be completely sucked in. Okay, sorry about that rant, but I will continue talking about the Metro series until it gets the recognition it truly deserves. For those of you who don't know, the Metro series is based on a popular Russian novel by
Dmitry Gluchovsky
called Metro 2033. I actually highly recommend it if you like the game and also don't mind Russian nihilism dialed to 10. The series follows an underground society of survivors living in Moscow's metro system after a nuclear holocaust destroys the entire world. Aside from a few crazies and badasses, no one ventures out of the metro, and for the most part, the survivors have created an almost self-sustained ecosystem underground without any sunlight or blue sky. Today I want to ask the question, is this possible? And does Moscow really have such an extensive and well-prepared subway system? Unlike our shallow rat-filled subways here in New York City, the Moscow Metro was actually built not only for transportation, but also as a shelter in case of a nuclear attack. The other being more afraid of you than you are of them also applies to the Cold War. The first metro line under Moscow began construction in the early 1930s. They were based on plans that dated back to the Russian Empire times. This was long before Wolverine saved that Japanese soldier at Nagasaki from the atomic bomb, and even longer before the Iron Curtain divided the Allies after World War II. The first line spanned from
Sokolniki
Park to the city center. The opening of the line in 1935 was hailed as a huge victory and pride for the city. Russia at the time was still rapidly modernizing, so most of the work was done without mechanized equipment and built with more basic hand tools. The design itself was made by British engineers who had worked on the London Underground, and after the entire project was complete, the NKVD assassinated them. I'm just joking, that didn't happen, but these British engineers did have a lot of access to some high-level secrets about Moscow's topography. As we go through all these pictures of the Moscow underground, you'll probably notice just how beautifully designed and decorated many of these stations are. You see, this was a very important project for Stalin, who was desperate to prove to the world that socialism was superior to the capitalist West, which at the time was mired in the Great Depression. After all, if you're going to take everyone's private property away from them, you might as well give them some glorious public works to show for it. Now, the northeastern part of the subway line, which was further away from the city center, was built with a cut and cover construction method. This means that a trench is first dug and then roofed over with concrete or some other type of material. This type of construction usually results in more shallow tunnels, so the
Сокольники.
Park Station is only around 9 meters deep. While this method of constructing a tunnel is cheaper and faster, it also disrupts the surface greatly and can only be used in areas that are less developed. And in the case of our scenario here, there's also less soil protecting you from a giant explosion up top. As we get closer to the city center, most of the tunnels there are built through excavation, but even then, most of the stations on the first line, which were opened up in 1935, were still quite shallow.
Библиотека имени Ленина.
The station was excavated, but sitting just 2 meters below the ground. It provided just enough soil to reduce gamma ray exposure from a blast, but let's say your enemy knows about your underground shelters and decides, instead of detonating their payloads in the air, like at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they let the nukes detonate at ground level. In this case, 2 meters of soil does very little to protect you. The first nuclear detonation in human history, codenamed Trinity, featured a tiny 22 kiloton device which was detonated at around 30 meters in the air. The explosion created a crater about 1.5 meters deep. A device like the B-83 thermonuclear bunker buster could penetrate a bunker built 1,000 feet below the ground. After the end of World War II, construction of underground shelters began all around Moscow to protect government and military officials, and lastly, the citizens. These shelters were built under factories, apartment buildings, and each one of Stalin's 7 skyscrapers, and also each district in Moscow had their own public shelters as well. But the subway system was also seen as a natural place to shelter massive amounts of civilians, and soon all of the new subway stations and lines were designed as fallout shelters as well. And many of the older subway stations and lines were reinforced to create more blast protection against a potential attack. And yes, just like in the Metro game, these subway systems had pressurized blast doors along with air filtration systems, stockpiles of fresh water and supplies, and diesel generators to keep everything powered. All of this is fully integrated into Moscow's civil defense system, and as more tunnels and stations were made, they were also being placed deeper and deeper. In 2003, a station at Park Pobedi was opened and became one of the deepest metro stations in the world at 84 meters underground. 4 years ago, the deputy head of the Russian Emergency Situation Ministry stated that 100% of Moscow's population would be able to fit in the network of fallout shelters and subway systems beneath the ground. I'm not really sure if I believe him 100%, but it doesn't really matter. Usually in a nuclear strike, there's not enough warning to get everyone underground. And yes, I'm talking about you, Russian Steve. As you're watching this video on YouTube, you are missing the air raid sirens that are blaring outside, and you'll probably not make it to the metro before they close off the blast doors, and you'll probably turn into a mutant. And that's what happens in Metro 2033. About only 200,000 people, or about 1.6% of the city, make it into the metro system in time before they're completely sealed off from the surface. What's even more cool is if you take a look at the main character's subway map in the novel, it's actually based on the real thing. For instance, VDNKH is RTM's home station, which is also known as Exhibition because it's right next to the Exhibition of Achievement of National Economy.
Библиотека имени Ленина.
The station that we were just talking about before is actually a real location as well, and it's home to the Russian State Library, where you encounter those terrifying librarians in the game. And that shallow first subway line that we talked about is also known as the Red Line. It's also where the communist faction takes over in the Metro game. Another really cool thing about the story in Metro 2033 is after the vault doors are shut, each station evolves into their own little microcosm, led by the type of survivors that made it inside. Most of these stations were ideologically neutral and just focused on survival. Some of these stations were run by military or government officials. Others depended on religion, either political or theocratic, to gain control of their people. Another one of the storylines in Metro 2033 that's really interesting is that there's a rumor that there's a secret government subway line that runs beneath the Moscow Metro. It's supposed to connect a series of government bunkers to one another and ultimately led to a massive facility known as D6, which held a large cache of weapons, technology, and supplies. A lot of people believe that Russia's leaders were all still living in the secret metro line and controlling everything in the wider Moscow Metro. Like most conspiracies, this created a sense of ease in the people of the metro that someone was still in control and had the ability to shape the direction of humanity in this very dangerous post-apocalyptic world. Interestingly enough, in real life, there are rumors that such a secret metro line exists, and it's also known as Metro 2 like it is in the game. Now, Metro 2 was supposedly built during the time of Stalin and also codenamed D6 by the KGB. Like in the game, Metro 2 is supposed to have 4 lines, and it's much deeper than the normal Moscow Metro with depths ranging from 50 to 200 meters. The line is supposed to connect the FSB headquarters with the Kremlin and also a regional airport, along with a massive underground town built underneath the
Раменки.
sector of Moscow. The existence of such a secret metro line is neither confirmed or denied by the FSB or Moscow's local government, but there is a lot of evidence that this place does exist. In 1991, the US DoD published a report which had several pages on the secret government underground networks in Moscow, including a diagram of the network imposed on an aerial map. They also mention a gigantic underground complex where Russia's leaders would assume command in the case of a nuclear holocaust. This bunker, which is known as D6 in Metro 2033, was estimated to be around 200 to 300 meters deep and could accommodate up to 10,000 people. Several high-ranking Russian officials and military leaders have also commented about the existence of this tunnel as well.
Владимир Шевченко,
Former advisor to Presidents
Горбачев, Ельцин,
and
Putin.
has commented that the secret subway system is now requiring major repairs. Other reports have stated that these underground bunkers are now flooded and are deteriorating. So when I came into this video, I didn't really know much about the Moscow Underground, but I was really surprised to find out that a lot of the elements in the Metro 2033 series are actually based on real life, which kind of makes me want to go visit Moscow now. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that life is a movie, and you are the protagonist.